With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen and Natasha to talk about the link between diet, mental health, and addiction. So you guys take it over.
Thank you so much, Mario, and to everybody in your community and for the participants tonight taking some time out of your evenings to be with us.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to the team. Like, putting this together has been a huge group effort, team effort. And it's just very exciting to be part of this family forum. And I hope that people get a lot out of what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to kick things off. Unfortunately, I always have to kick off with this slightly boring, this will be the most boring slide, but just saying that this presentation is for educational and informational purposes and not intended to constitute medical advice, consultation, recommendation, diagnosis, or treatment, because I don't have a license in Michigan. So, so really this is an opportunity for hopefully you to refine some information that you may or may not have known and to have some tools to implement as we go along.
Kristen, I just wanted to interrupt briefly. I forgot to mention, those of you who have questions, and I'm sure you're going to have them, just shoot us a question in the chat feature. Natasha is going to be looking at all those questions. And at the conclusion of the presentation, we're going to take the time to answer all of them. Sorry.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Absolutely. Kristen. And so we are going to ask for some of your participation, and if you want to just comment, put it in the chat. If you have Q&A, you put it in the Q&A. That'll be easy for us to find, because there's going to be a couple of times where I'm like, hey, what do you think of this? And you can add it to the chat box. So that's kind of the two pathways. Natasha's really good at moving through both of those. So, you know, if you make a mistake, no problem. So I want to just start with a story of a patient who's pretty typical of who I see in terms of recovery as a naturopathic physician and acupuncturist. I've been working with people in recovery for about 18 years. So I'm going to tell you about Jill. And Jill started using alcohol and drugs in high school, just a little, you know, social, recreational, like just a little, and was introduced to opioids at a dental appointment for wisdom teeth. And then she went off to college and things were a lot harder, and she used drugs and alcohol to manage her emotions. And then by her junior year, she failed out and came home, took her parents a little bit to figure out what was going on, did inpatient, did groups, saw therapists, you know, stepped in and out of recovery a number of times, and then ended up in my office. And we sat down, and the first appointment I was like, so what do you eat? She's like, well, I'm working part-time at this job, and I got to get up early. So usually I have coffee, and maybe I'll have a piece of toast, and then lunch. What do you eat for lunch? Oh, well, you know, I don't know. It varies from day to day. And sometimes I just skip lunch and then dinner, because she was still living at home. She had a pretty good dinner. I was just like, well, what are you feeding this brain that you're trying to get to change during the day? And she's like, oh, not much, I guess. I hadn't thought about that. And so I gave her some tools. We're going to cover some of the tools today around that in terms of helping her. The other thing that was striking is her energy. She was really fatigued and was having a hard time doing a part-time job and trying to stay sober and go to groups. So she was really tired, and she was prone to panic attacks and high anxiety. And her job was going pretty well, but the boss wanted her to do more, and she didn't want to do more because it made her anxious. And so today we're really going to focus on how to control anxiety, what's behind that physiologically, and how to do well at high stakes events. During the book club, we're going to really put together the program we put together for Jill, where over time, what she realized is when she didn't take care of her body, that was when she was set up to use. And so Natasha's going to help frame that up a little more, but I just wanted to give you a story to hang on in terms of like what we're talking about today. So Natasha's going to give you some framework that I use and we use in our book to help people be at their best.
Thanks so much, Kristen, for sharing that story. And I think it's really helpful because it takes some of these ideas that Kristen and I talk about, and it makes them a little more concrete so we can sort of relate to them, perhaps in our lives or in the lives of people we connect to. So one of the things I heard in the story that Kristen shared was that even though she's struggling, Jill really does want to make different choices in her life. So I want to connect how we think about Jill's story to how we think about hope in our work. More than a decade ago, Dr. Chan Hellman, who wrote the foreword of our book, set out to understand how hope impacts individuals in what often appear to be really hopeless situations. We're defining hope as the belief that a thriving future is possible and that you have the power to make that so. Kristen and I talk about hope in our work because really at a deeper level, we're doing what we do because we want people to have more hope for what's possible in their lives. And that overlapped a lot with what Mario shared about his goals as well. So in Chan's book, Hope Rising, hope is broken down into two key components: willpower and way power. Willpower is what excites you. It's what's unique to you and to your motivations. It combines that personal investment, really wanting to work towards that goal of yours, with brain smart nutrition, which gives you the energy and mental clarity needed to follow through on the changes you're resolving to make. Way power is about having a mental roadmap and arcing out achievable steps along the way. Understanding what the very next step is can support the ability to overcome challenges as well as the emotions that might come up as you're facing those challenges. So in Jill's story, she was really focused initially on just not using anymore. She wanted to get clean and not necessarily thinking about feeling better. And that's one of the things that Kristen always asks her clients, like, are you feeling better? Let's do experiments. Are you feeling better? Can you tell a difference? So Jill was going to groups and getting the tools she needed to develop her way power, but she was still slipping up mostly in the afternoons after not feeding herself well, being fatigued. And she was just naturally more tired later in the day. So she didn't have that energy or the brain smart nutrition on board to help her navigate her emotions and anxiety without reaching for a substance for support. So this really was a willpower issue. We think this is significant because many people have lost hope for achieving their dreams because anxiety, depression, fatigue, other mental health challenges can get in the way, and they can fuel cravings and really sap people of the energy and mental clarity needed to take those small steps laid out in their way power. The same skills Jill needed to stay sober in the end were also what were going to be the skills that would help her figure out moving forward in her life to either going back to school, getting a job that she was more engaged in, whatever that was. She was essentially learning how she learned information and creating that stable platform to take more steps towards things that she would find enjoyment from. Next slide. So I'm going to give you some language now, some of the words that we use that will help, that Kristen will be talking about later. So this is just to sort of anchor you in the framework that we use in our work. When we talk about supporting hope, we think primarily about 4 areas that are affected by anxiety, fatigue, depression, but these same areas can also directly support well-being and resilience. So first there's the body, which we refer to as the power supply. When people provide their bodies with what it needs, the body in turn support the physical health as well as the brain by fueling decision-making, creativity, and our ability to use emotions to understand who we are. When we have a well-fueled and cared-for body, we have the energy to engage in relationships and in our lives more generally. Then there's the brain. The brain is really complex and it works to filter all the information coming in from our senses and really works to keep us alive. It's a sort of survival mechanism. And different parts of the brain determine how we experience the world around us that we're in. The power supply from the body influences directly which part of the brain is filtering that information. For simplicity, we're going to just talk about the brain in two modes, reactive or responsive. And you already heard Kristen talk a little bit about this when she was discussing the Protein for All program at the beginning. So, and Kristen will get into the details of those two modes in a little bit. But functionally, if your body is well taken care of through nutrition, movement, and sleep, the brain can filter information in a more thoughtful, responsive way. If the body's needs are neglected, we tend to be more anxious, depressed, definitely more easily triggered and reactive. And the chance of us needing or reaching for external supports for managing our emotions goes way up. The relation piece over there on the right also influences how you feel. So when we say relationship, we mean the relationships you have with other people, but also what kind of environment you're in, what you're surrounded by. Some relationships can be stable and caring and safe, and others can really be just the opposite. So in Jill's story, she was at college and struggling a little bit, but she was able to find supportive relationships by going back home and then getting into treatment and going to meetings. And the relationship piece, we think, is especially important in building that way power. So getting the tools to understand what your next step is, and in finding our way to and staying in recovery. The fourth area is the mind or the software. So when our bodies, brains, and relationships are all working together, our minds are clear and in the present moment. We can be curious and engaged instead of seeing the world through this survival reactive mode. If we think about Jill again, in her story that Kristen shared, she was doing pretty well on the relationship piece. She got some tools that her brain could use to help keep her on track. And when her mind was clear, she did a good job of staying in recovery. But the missing piece, the part that Kristen was able to help her fill in really, was understanding the importance of stabilizing the power supply so that her body, brain, and relationships could all work together to form that clear mind. In effect, having enough energy in her body helped her brain be able to access the tools and to recognize the support from her relationships. And then her mind was able to make better choices. Without that stable energy, the habitual brain just overrides the tool-focused brain, and it becomes a lot harder to navigate relationships, and substance use starts looking pretty attractive for regulating emotional content. Next slide. So the focus of our work, and what Kristen is going to explain in a lot more detail next, is on how people can improve that power supply from the body to the brain so we can stay in that clear-minded state. And essentially that helps us have more energy to engage in our lives in purposeful ways. So our goals for tonight are to connect how hope and fueling your brain relate to recovery, to help you understand how what you eat and how frequently you eat or don't eat can affect decision-making and moods. We're going to provide some really concrete tools that you can start using immediately to reduce anxiety, agitation, irritation, early morning waking, and cravings. And then, as you've heard a little bit about from Mario already, we'll be sharing more information about the book club so we can continue the learning journey together. One last note before I pass it back to Kristen. As Mario said, we're going to have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. but you don't have to save up those questions as we go along. So as Kristen's presenting the material, just go ahead if you have questions, or if you're not sure of something, drop it right into the Q&A box in Zoom. And I'll be monitoring both Q&A and chat. And at a couple points, we are going to be asking for your feedback and your participation, and we'll be primarily using the chat box for that, but we'll remind you as we get to those points.
Awesome.
So Kristen, back to you.
Thanks, Natasha, for that explanation. Let's just jump off into something that everybody's really familiar with, which is HALT, or HALTs, as I like to call it, because one of my patients changed it and I went along with that. Hungry, angry, anxious, lonely, tired. If you're on the path of recovery, probably you were handed this tool at the very beginning to the first person you talk to. And we've rewritten it a little because hungry is hypoglycemic. And hypoglycemic means low blood glucose, which means that your brain, your smart, responsive brain, may not have all the fuel that it needs to be in charge of what you're doing. And then angry, anxious, agitated, those are things that show up when you're hypoglycemic. Lonely certainly can be a trigger for using, but I know that when I am low in glucose, I feel more lonely when I'm alone. Tired certainly can be a trigger, but that also relates to too little sleep, or too not sleeping consistently or at the same time or enough, and then stressed. And so we're going to go into a lot more details, particularly on that hypoglycemic. We're going to talk a little bit about sleep, but we'll do that more in the book club in the fall if you're interested. And then stressed. When we're stressed, that means our brain needs more fuel. And what tends to happen when we're stressed is that our brain needs more fuel. And so our digestive system shuts down and to get more glucose to our brain. And so we're not hungry when we're stressed, which then makes us low in blood glucose, and then makes our feelings of loneliness and tiredness louder. And so then we're back into that cycle. So you guys have seen this all over and over and over again. And I just wanted to anchor you in what you already know. And I'm just going to go into some of the physiological details. Now, some of you just went, whoa, we're going to do science. And I'm like, yeah, I've explained this to mental health professionals a lot, and they're not very sciencey. So just hang on. Most people can get through this. And if you have questions, just put it in the Q&A. So one of the first things I always start with when somebody comes into my office is, what's your power supply? Like, how much energy do you have? Like, and just rate it. What's the high and what's the low generally in the day? And generally what I hear when people come in is, or when I hear that people are like 6 at the highest and then to a 4, I'm like, oh, life is really hard. And it's really hard to change when you have so little energy. When people get their energy supply up to hitting 6, 7s, maybe 8s and 9s, then we can actually get change in our life. And so we really want to work to increase our power supply within our body so that our brain can actually remodel itself. So let's talk what happens to our body, and then we'll talk about our brain when we go too long without eating. So what is too long without eating? Well, for most people who are in recovery or who have PTSD or who have mental health problems, really it's about more than 3 or 4 hours. So let's just stick to the extreme with people who are like, yeah, I don't eat all day because I'm not hungry. Okay, let's look at what's going on there. So the brain has declining fuel to the brain, and the brain says, I need fuel. It releases a whole bunch of hormones. One of the hormones is adrenaline. There's glucagon. If you're in the medical world, you know glucagon, and there's some other hormones. But we're just going to track adrenaline because adrenaline affects the body and the brain. And so this cocktail goes to the liver and says, we need more fuel, because the liver is what can increase our fuel supply to our brain. So the liver can say, okay, I can make glucose for the brain. Fat tissue is always available for deposit. It's always like, hey, come on in, have a seat. You never have to leave. That's the nature of fat, because 1,000 years ago, there was not a lot of extra food. So as humans, we cannot make glucose out of fat. We can only make it out of protein. And protein is either going to come from our diet or it's going to come from our muscle mass. If it comes from our muscle mass, then it's going to decrease our metabolic rate, which decreases the number of calories that we can consume in a day without gaining weight. So part of the reason why I hate quick weight loss programs is most quick weight loss programs, you lose muscle mass. And when you lose muscle mass, you are losing the substrate, in my opinion, that helps both mental and physical health. So why does muscle mass help both physical and mental health? Well, every time you move your body, any muscle, you make brain-derived neurotropic factor, which actually helps your brain learn faster. So instead of seeing something 7 times, you can see it 3 or 4 times. So if you like throw your arms in the air or do chair squats, like right now, I am making brain-derived neurotropic factor. Now, usually I don't do this, but I need to do something that's in the camera, so it's obvious that I'm moving my body, right? But moving my muscles that way, I increase my heart rate, I get more fuel to my brain, and I get more brain-derived neurotropic factor. The other thing that it does is it prevents insulin receptivity diseases. There is more and more evidence that mental health problems are due to insulin receptivity problems, but for sure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and dementia are insulin receptivity diseases. But it's also part of this is inflammation, which is definitely linked to mental health problems. The other reason why we want to keep muscle mass as high as possible is because muscle mass burns fat mass. And so the only way you really get fat mass off your body is to actually use your muscles in the form of exercise and not be stealing the muscle mass from it to fuel your brain. So there are consequences, long-term health consequences to using your body as a fuel source and ignoring that your body needs to be fed frequently. So let's go to the brain and what happens with the brain when it's demanding fuel. So there's 3 parts of the brain. We're going to talk about all 3 and when you use them. So there's the prefrontal cortex. This is our responsive brain. This is our smart brain, right? This is where we do abstract thinking and executive functioning and associative thinking. Associative thinking is really important. So if I ask you if you know anybody who has depression or anxiety, I bet you can name 2 or 3 people in your life who you think have depression or anxiety. That's associative thinking. I haven't mentioned any of those people. And I don't know any of those people, but you can put it together. And that is what's unique to humans and not computers. And quite honestly, we're all competing against the computer as a competitor in the work market. And us being able to think clearly is an important part of that. The other thing that the prefrontal cortex does is it can sit on this limbic lizard brain. So what's going on in this limbic lizard brain? This is the part of our brain that's about survival. I kind of call it the ugly basement, where, you know, like some people have those ugly basements that they just put all the stuff in that they don't want to deal with anymore, right? And so we all learn things as children that may or may not be helpful today. And I think a lot of people, studies show, who are in recovery have PTSD of some form. There are things that happened in our lives that were not pleasant, that we don't want to deal with. We put it in the basement. But if we're reminded of it, we go into fight, flight, or disappear mode. And so fight is irritation. Flight is anxiety. Disappear mode is where you're like, la, 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 la. For me, that is Ben & Jerry's ice cream and Netflix. When I'm done and I want to know exactly what my emotions are going to be, and I do not want to be impacted by any other input so that I can have one more emotional upset today, like Ben & Jerry's ice cream, Netflix. Other people, alcohol, substances, being on the internet. There's all sorts of things where we can like shut this down. Addiction is hardwired into the limbic system. So when you're talking to somebody who wants to get in recovery, but cannot figure out how to give up their substance of choice, it's because their survival brain says, I will die if I don't have this. And so it's really important to be able to control and inhibit this lizard brain in order to get into recovery. So the hippocampus, this is what we haven't talked about. So the hippocampus, well, I'm going to do sensory. So how does our brain know anything that's going on? It's because of our senses. What we see, smell, hear, taste, feel, and our ability to feel inside of our body. This could be like, can I feel my heart rate or my breathing? But it can also be asking the question, but what's the best course for me? This gets back to that willpower, right? Are you doing something because somebody wants you to do it, or are you doing it because you want to do it? And if you can legitimately say, no, this is my goal, and I know this is my goal, that's actually a sense. So how do we know which part of the brain we're going to go to? Well, the hippocampus is what's in charge of attention and emotions and planning and behavior. So what we are spending our time focused on, are we spending our time focused on taking care of ourselves and going to groups and doing what we need to be at the job? Or are we spending our time on how we're going to get our next hit? What determines that is our hippocampus. And what determines that toggle of, are we in our responsive brain or our reactive brain? That is determined in part of how much adrenaline and glucose is in the system. And when there's low glucose and high adrenaline, the adrenaline stops all sensory information going to your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus, and it all gets filtered into the limbic brain, and your lizard says, we should go use. We should totally do that. That will solve this problem, because it solved the problem hundreds, if not thousands of tens of thousands of times. And so that's what we focus on. I want to give you a quick example of how this comes up. So I'm a martial artist. I've done martial arts for Aikido specifically for more than 20 years. And when I was a 3rd degree black belt, I was at a beginner's class. And I bowed into this guy. And so if we were in the same room, you would look at me and you're like, she is tall, because I'm like 6 foot. And so I bowed into this guy who was like 5'7", and my brain said, he's gonna kill you. And I was, which is, anxiety, right? He's gonna kill you. And I'm like, and I know to challenge that thought. And I'm like, so why is he gonna kill me? Like, is he a martial artist? And he wasn't coordinated enough to be a martial artist. Every once in a while, the karate or the taekwondo people are like, let's go play with the aikidos, because they don't really know how to hit, right? And so that's kind of like sport for them. Anyway, he didn't seem to be that person. I was like, is he high on drugs? Because we've had people come high on drugs. That's a little dangerous. And so like, I might get that signal from my brain. My senses are saying I'm going to get killed. And I was like, no, he does not seem like he's high on drugs. And so I'm like, oh, okay, well, what else could it be? Why do I think he's going to kill me? And then I'm like, when was the last time you ate? Oh, yeah, we haven't eaten since lunch, and it's now 7 o'clock. So that's 7 hours. And so we've got adrenaline in our system. And this person is reminding me of my life has been threatened a couple of times when I was a kid. And there must have been something about this guy who reminded me of when my life has been threatened, and it was right there. Even though I was a black belt, I was around my community, there was no way anybody could hurt me, and I was getting this very clear signal that I was in danger. And it was BS. It was just my lizard brain sending me erroneous signals. So you all know that your brain lies to you regularly, right? So know that might come up. So hopefully and if you have questions, but put it in the Q&A, but that's the difference between your responsive brain and your reactive brain. We're going to go into just a few more details. So how do we get there? So when we look at this over time, let's say somebody has toast for breakfast, like Jill had toast for breakfast. So our blood glucose is going to go up, and then insulin's going to sweep it into cells, and blood glucose is going to start dropping as far as your brain is concerned in about 1.5 to 2 hours. And if she continues on that and her blood glucose drops below a certain level, she's going to get a signal of adrenaline, and it's bear in the room, right? You could hear that in my story, bear in the room. Somebody's going to kill you, right? And it has nothing to do with reality. Sometimes it adds up to reality and we overreact. So how does this have to do with willpower? So when we look at studies around willpower, so they do a study and they're like, okay, we want you to work really hard to get this done, that requires willpower. And so they make everybody do that. And then they feed people either sugar lemonade or NutraSweet lemonade. The people who got sugar can have more endurance to do another act of willpower. And sitting and listening to somebody talk on a video that's not in the room, that's an act of willpower. Staying sober is an act of willpower, right? And so you have to have fuel to your brain. One more study. This is my favorite study. Some of you may want to put answers in the chat box for this. So a lot of the studies on humans are done on college students because it's easy to corral them in and they are happy to get paid nominal fees to do research. But they're like, that is not a fully developed brain. It's not an educated brain. And so they took judges, and this is also how I kind of got into the court system, because I was raised by lawyers, I'm married to a lawyer, and I watched the literature on lawyers. But so they took judges who were reading files for parole, right? And so they're just 2 piles: consider for parole, another year in jail, right? And they knew they were in a study, but they thought they were in an implicit bias study around race. But it was really, do you make different decisions based on when you were last fed? So immediately after a meal, 65% of people were considered for parole. I want you to just take a moment. If you want, throw in the chat how many people were considered, what percentage were considered for parole immediately before a meal, like right before the meal. How many people with all these judges are getting parole? And you can just throw it in the chat. I'm seeing
40%, 15, 20, 85, 10.
Those are great choices. And the answer is 0. Nobody's going to get out for a year. Shocking, isn't it? That's how different your responsive brain versus your reactive brain. Now, if you interviewed these judges and said, are you anxious, irritable? Are you wanting to disappear? Do you feel bad? They're like, no, I just want to eat. But their brain, that toggle has already shifted into being more conservative and not letting anybody out. Kind of shocking, isn't it? The lawyers are always like, how do I know when the judge last had a meal? And like, I was like, you got to develop those relationships with their clerks. I can't help you there. Okay, so now we're going to go to the solution. So now we know, like, it's a problem to not eat. And it's a problem to just eat carbohydrates like the cereals and toast and pasta. And so what we really want to do, and we're going to develop this more in the book club, and it's developed more in the book. But for today, we're just going to keep it pretty simple. That eating a meal, which has protein, carbs, fat, and fiber. Now, if you're in early recovery, truthfully, I'm like, let's just get the protein and carbs in. We'll worry about the vegetables once you get 2 or 3 months into recovery. Like, just get the protein and fats, or protein and carbs. Because when you do that, you've doubled the amount of time you're in your smart brain before you get low in glucose. And the other difference is when we eat sugar and like cereal, our blood glucose goes up really fast and it comes down really fast. It comes down so fast that actually our body can't respond and turn it around without using all that adrenaline. Where here, it has resources that it might pull it out without another meal. And I got to tell you, when people are in early recovery, those mechanisms are a little funky, but you can develop them over time so that Like it can be a little more self-stabilizing, but people in early recovery are very dependent upon external forms of fuel in order to function. So I wanted to just give you some concrete, like how much does fueling your brain make a difference for anxiety, depression, and PAWS, post-acute withdrawal syndrome. So the GAD-7 is a way that mental health professionals assess anxiety. And when people fuel their brain, what I see is at least a 30% drop in anxiety, sometimes as much as a 50% drop in anxiety. I'm not going to say anxiety completely goes away because anxiety is part of life. It's just, is it low enough that we can use the cognitive skills that we're learning in groups and with our therapist to move forward and move through that anxiety rather than avoiding it. And what I see is when people fuel their brain regularly, these are the symptoms that get better. They're not as nervous or anxious or on edge. They can relax more. They're less restless and they're less irritable. Because that makes sense. Their prefrontal cortex is fueled and they're not in their reactive brain. Now, worrying too much and unable to stop worrying, that has a lot to do with historic trauma. Again, feeling afraid that something awful might happen, like probably that's because awful things have happened in your life. And that's going to take some practice to move away from those patterns. But we're not going to do that if we're not in our smart brain. For depression, so when somebody comes in to see me and they say they're depressed, I'm like, how do you know that you're not fatigued? Because there's fatigue and there's depression and there's about this much overlap, and it takes a while and a number of experiments to separate them. But here's the PHQ-7 or 9, and when people start fueling their brain and increasing their power supply with food, sleep, exercise, and breathing, what I find is that these symptoms get better. They're able to have more pleasure. They're able to fall asleep and stay asleep. They're less tired. They have a better appetite because when we're in our adrenaline state, all the blood is going to our major muscles and there's not a lot of blood in our digestive system, so we're not hungry. They're better able to concentrate on things because our prefrontal cortex is engaged. And their speech is either not manic because they're high on adrenaline or not really slow because they have fuel in their brain to speak. Post-acute withdrawal symptoms, probably you are all people who are in recovery are familiar with this. Here's all the descriptors. What I find is when I work with people in early recovery, I am a wellness director at a couple of treatment centers. What I find is when we really focus on getting the food in, small, consistent meals throughout the day and getting consistent sleep, these clear up, which then allows us to clean up these things, right? So difficult relationships, maintaining difficult relationships and having difficult relationships or obsessive compulsive, that is a complex thing that has to be managed, but we're only going to manage it by having the power supply, which is by feeding our brain and getting these to decrease. Hopefully that's making sense to people. So hopefully at this point you're like, okay, I know what I need to do. I need to keep my power supply up so that I have less anxiety, less irritation, less cravings. Like, let's focus on power supply. And what you're going to do, what helps power supply is small, frequent meals with protein, carbs, fat, and fiber. Getting consistent sleep, 7 to 9 hours, going to bed about the same time, getting up at the same time. When you have a big variation, like sometimes you go to bed at 9, sometimes you go to bed at 2, sometimes you get up and do something on your phone. Mostly I'm like, get your phones out of your bedrooms, like sleep. Naps are great, but I really want people sleeping at consistent times. So we'll talk more about that in the book club. Move your body. Now, if you're like the biggest number you get in the day is a 5 on your power supply, yeah, don't go exercise. Like first focus on fueling your brain and getting more sleep. Once you get into 6 and 7s, then go for 10-minute walks and really start building in an exercise routine, but it can be small power-ups, but don't overdo it until you have a decent power supply. The last thing that is not in the book and is, we'll talk a little bit in book club, but James Nestor wrote an amazing book on breathing that I've added to this. So breathing through your nose increases the oxygen to your body by 20%. It's really important to just close your mouth. If you're not speaking, close your mouth and breathe. And there are some reasons why people in early recovery cannot do that. And we'll talk about that in the book club.
Hey, Kristen?
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted
Go
to,
ahead.
is that a reason why many rehab clinics are big proponents of breathing exercises, meditation? That the thing that you just,
It's one of the reasons why, and the, like, this is new to me in the last 2 years, which is why I didn't get into the book, but like it's totally changed my approach to, and we can do a little in Q&A, but breathing is really important. Yeah. Okay. So I want to give you some immediate tools to use. So first we're going to talk about lizard brain treats. And there's a whole handout on this. We're going to show you the handout, but the most simple lizard brain treat is a little bit of juice and a handful of nuts. And why the juice is that we want to have a quick fuel to get to that prefrontal cortex and say, we got this, and we can get into our responsive brain. Please turn off the adrenaline. And then we have the nuts, which is fat, protein, and fiber, so that it's that slow burning fuel that we need, because we're going to burn the little bit of juice really quick. And so here are the times and places that I would be helpful to consider a lizard brain treat. When somebody's anxious, irritated, agitated, or mostly upset. In the last year and a half with COVID, I have had a lot of people who are anxious, irritable, and upset. And I've been doing a lot of virtual meetings. And so somebody gets on the Zoom call and they're like, and I'm like, go to your kitchen. Take me to your kitchen. Take your computer to your kitchen right now. And they're like, there's nothing in the kitchen to eat. I'm like, there has got to be something to eat. There has got to be honey. There has got to be sugar. Go into the kitchen. And then they get there and they're like, oh yeah, there's food. And they get a spoon of honey and a handful of nuts. And in 10 minutes, they go from to like, oh, hi. So what's going on? Like, and you could just see this switch where they're in this hyper reactive brain and they get their prefrontal cortex. This could be you. This could be a loved one. This could be a little kid. This could certainly be an adolescent. If you have adolescents in your home, do not talk to them when they're all wound up. Don't talk to lizards. That is a rule of mine. Feed the lizard, but don't talk to them. So another place where a lizard brain treat is really helpful is early morning waking, or what I call 3 a.m. committee meetings. How you know it's a committee meeting is your brain wants to talk to you for 2 hours. Not like, hey, you need to go to the bathroom, and then, okay, now we're ready to settle down. No, this is like, la, 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 and then he should have said, and I should have said, and we're going to do, and da, 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 right? Like, and so what that is your brain ran out of fuel, and now it's woken up and it is on fire and wants you to solve all the problems because there's so much adrenaline there. You want to, if you know this happens, just put a little juice and nuts by the bedstand and eat it and drink it. And then generally within 30 minutes, you'll go back to sleep. If this is also helping, eating a little protein right before bed also helps. So if you're somebody who's unable to wake up in the morning, or wake up really anxious, or not able to eat, these are all signs that you're low in glucose and high in adrenaline. So not being able to eat in the morning is because there's no blood going to your digestive system. So if you drink just the juice, don't eat the nuts, just a little bit of the juice, or a little spoonful of honey, what's going to happen is your brain's going to be like, hey, thanks for the fuel. And now we're running out, so go get breakfast. And if a lot of people in early recovery wake really anxious, don't just feed that lizard brain, be like, hey, here's some juice, here's some nuts. We're going to get breakfast together. And then there are people who just have sometimes they don't even get anxious. Their blood glucose is so low that they're just almost comatose, and they'll come enough awake that they'll put juice and nuts in, and then they'll kind of fall asleep. And within the half hour, they'll wake up and be able to go get a meal. So the last place is that's helpful to eat a lizard brain treat is when you're transitioning from one hat to another. So if you're going from job to family mode, particularly before COVID, when I was working with parents in early recovery, I'm like, don't walk into your house unless you're fed if you have small children, because you're going to walk in and you're going to be like, hey, I'm going to go in, and the kids are going to be like, whoa, mom, dad, blah, blah, blah. And you're trying to make dinner and they're like, whoa, I got to listen to the story. Blah, blah, blah. And you're like, oh, I just need a drink to get through this, right? Because that's what alcohol is calories. How about just juice and a handful of nuts to get through? And by the way, feed the kids because they're probably hypoglycemic as well. So one other tool that I want to give you tonight is lizard brain meals. And so when you know something important is coming, may this be an interview, an exam in school, going to court, like in Jill's story, her boss wanted her to take the next step because she was doing a good job, and she didn't want to because she was so anxious. And let's say she needed to do a small presentation to the people that she knows. It made her so anxious and nauseous that she didn't even want to do it. I was like, hey, let's just have a little bit of a sandwich, a half a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I have people do this before they go to therapy because I don't know about you, but when I talk to my therapist, it's not always pleasant. And sometimes we talk about hard things. And when I fuel myself, then I'm better engaged rather than my lizard brain running around the apartment or getting a protein bar or a shake or something like that. So when to use: before an important meeting or conversation, before doing something that requires emotional intelligence, like if you're going to have a hard conversation with your spouse or your child, feed yourself before that. Before making pivotal decisions. Whoops, we're going to go back one. I want to tell you a story. So I do lead wellness meetings at an addiction recovery center for men who are leaving homelessness and getting on track. And there was this guy who heard this talk, a similar talk, and he's like, I have failed my electrician's exam 3 times. And I need to pass it this time. And if you're saying that if I eat a meal before I take my exam, I'll do better. And I'm like, absolutely. And I saw, and if he passes those tests, he goes from making almost nothing to making 6 digits, because being an electrician is an in-demand job. And there's 2 of them. And I saw him the day that he was going to take the second exam. He passed his first one, and he's really confident that he's going to pass the second one because he's fueling himself before doing something important, even though he doesn't feel like it. Because physiologically, when we did really important things, it was like killing a buffalo. You want as much adrenaline in the system as possible for that. But this is using our smart brain. So there's some handouts that Natasha is going to put in the chat box for you to do. And we're running a little late on time, so I'm going to let you look through those. And then we have a page on recovery that you can look at. And in this packet, there's a handout on power supply and lizard brain treat and being at your best, and 3 days of protein. So, there's a little bit of explanation. So you have immediately tools that you can use for yourself and the people that you connect with, or you can buy the book, or if you can't afford the book, you can order the book. You can request the book through the family forum link. So before I hand it out, before we get into Q&A, I request that you will consolidate the learning better if you take a moment and put in the chat box, like, what are you taking home? that it was useful in this talk? What are you going to apply? So that's for you. How that is for me is the thing that I love doing most in the world is being useful. And when I'm sitting in my office talking to myself, it feels a little weird, even though Mario and Natasha have been smiling at me the whole time. Like, it's a little weird. So if you could put that, just take a moment to put that in the chat box, like, what are you taking home? What do you want to apply? You're more likely to apply it. And then I know I did a good job.